The morning air inside Stonehaven Hill was always cold, carrying the faint scent of old pine wood and beeswax. The grand estate sat on a lonely hill in the small town of Cold Spring, Vermont, surrounded by dark trees that kept the sun away from the windows. Lily Thompson moved through the long eastern hallway with a wooden bucket and a soft cotton cloth, her steps making no sound on the dark rugs. She wore a simple gray dress that reached her ankles and a plain white apron tied tightly around her waist. Her brown hair was pulled back into a neat braid, and she wore no jewelry or makeup to draw attention to herself. Lily had been working at the estate for 4 weeks, and most of the other workers barely noticed her come and go. She knelt down by the tall baseboards, dipping her cloth into the warm, soapy water before squeezing it out with practiced care. Her hands were rough from years of hard work, but her movements were incredibly gentle as she wiped away the dust. The house was massive, filled with heavy stone pillars, long corridors, and rooms that had stayed locked for decades. Lily did not mind the quiet or the endless list of chores, because the solitude gave her a sense of peace she had not felt in a long time. She kept her head down, focused entirely on the grain of the wood, making sure every corner was perfectly clean before moving to the next. A few minutes later, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway as Thomas, the elderly chauffeur, walked toward the main entrance. He stopped when he saw Lily, pulling a crumpled $5 bill from his coat pocket and holding it out toward her with a warm smile. He told her she had done a wonderful job cleaning the inside of the old car the night before and deserved a little extra. Lily stopped her work, rinsed her hands in the bucket, and looked up at him with a soft, appreciative smile. She gently pushed his hand away, telling him that she could not take the money because she was already paid well for her daily work. Thomas shook his head with a gentle laugh, telling her she was too honest for her own good, before tucking the money back into his pocket. He walked away, leaving Lily alone in the long hallway to finish her tasks under the dim morning light. She picked up her bucket and carried it toward the central staircase, completely unaware that someone was watching her from the shadows above. High on the dark wood balcony, Victor Prescott stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the young woman below as she walked away. His hair was completely white, falling softly around a face that looked like pale marble, and his dark coat stayed buttoned to his chin. Victor was the master of Stonehaven Hill, a man who rarely showed his face to the townspeople and never walked under the bright afternoon sun. For more than 2 centuries, he had ruled his people in secret, carrying the heavy burden of a vampire king who had seen the world change too many times. He had learned from a very young age that humans were driven by greed, always looking for a way to take more than they gave. He watched Lily through the carved wooden railings of the balcony, his sharp eyes noting the calm expression on her face as she worked. He did not trust her quiet nature, believing that anyone who seemed this perfect had to be hiding a dark secret. Later that afternoon, Victor sat in his private study on the top floor, where the thick velvet curtains were drawn tight against the daylight. The room was dark, lit only by the soft blue glow of 4 large security monitors on his heavy mahogany desk. The screens showed different areas of the estate, including the kitchen, the gardens, and the grand dining hall where Lily was currently working. He watched her adjust the heavy silver candlesticks on the long table, making sure each one was perfectly aligned with the center of the wood. She did not rush her movements, treating the old silver with a level of respect that surprised him. His assistant, a tall man named Richard who had served the family for 40 years, entered the room quietly with a stack of papers. Victor did not look up from the screens, asking his assistant if the new maid had truly refused every single tip the staff offered. Richard set the papers down and confirmed the report, stating that Lily had turned down extra money from the housekeeper as well. He added that she was the hardest worker they had hired in a long time, never complaining about the cold rooms or the heavy lifting. Victor leaned back in his leather chair, his white hair catching the dim light as he frowned at the monitor. He told Richard that people who acted entirely selfless were often the most dangerous because they were simply playing a much longer game to gain trust. He remembered a time during his youth when a trusted servant had smiled for years before stealing a priceless family artifact and vanishing into the night. That experience had taught him to look for the hidden motives behind every kind gesture, especially from those who had nothing. He turned his gaze back to the screen, watching Lily wipe the large glass windows until they were completely clear. He decided that he needed to know what she would do when she believed no one was watching her. The grandfather clock in the main living room struck 3 o'clock in the afternoon, its deep chimes echoing through the high ceilings of the estate. The room was beautiful but cold, filled with heavy velvet furniture, dark oil paintings, and large windows that overlooked the gray mountains. On the low oak coffee table in the center of the room, Victor had placed a heavy black leather wallet, an old gold pocket watch, and a neat stack of bills. The money clip held 5 crisp $100 bills, left out in the open as if someone had carelessly dropped them after a long day. It was a simple trap, designed to see if Lily could resist the temptation when left entirely alone. Victor lay perfectly still on the long green sofa nearby, his head resting against a soft pillow and his eyes closed. His long white hair was spread across the dark fabric, and his pale hands were crossed loosely over his chest, showing his expensive silver cufflinks. To any normal person, he looked like a wealthy man who had fallen into a deep afternoon sleep after hours of reading. In reality, Victor was wide awake, his sharp vampire senses capturing every sound, every movement, and even the rhythm of the wind outside. A tiny camera hidden behind a framed painting on the wall recorded the entire room, sending the live feed directly to his study. He heard the soft patter of Lily's shoes against the hardwood floor before she even reached the open doorway of the living room. She carried a small woven basket filled with clean dusting cloths and a bottle of polishing oil, moving with her usual quiet grace. She stopped at the edge of the room, her eyes instantly falling on the sleeping master of the house before drifting down to the table. Victor kept his breathing slow and shallow, tracking the sudden change in the air as she took a soft breath. He waited for the sound of rustling paper, expecting her to step closer to the money. Instead, Lily turned away from the coffee table entirely, walking over to the far corner of the room to begin her work on the bookshelves. She pulled a soft cloth from her basket and began wiping the dust from the heavy leather books, moving methodically from the top shelf to the bottom. She did not look back at the money, keeping her attention fixed on the tasks she had been given for the day. Victor remained motionless, his mind working through the unexpected silence as the minutes ticked by on the wall clock. He could hear the steady, calm beat of her heart, which did not speed up at all. After 20 minutes of dusting the shelves, Lily walked over to the coffee table, her movements slow and deliberate so she would not wake him. She picked up an empty porcelain teacup he had left behind earlier, setting it quietly into her basket, before looking down at the cash. She stood there for 3 seconds, her face entirely calm, showing neither greed nor fear, as she looked at the fortune lying on the wood. She reached out her hand, but instead of touching the money, she picked up a heavy hardcover novel from the lower shelf. She placed the book gently over the wallet and the cash, completely hiding them from view. She then walked over to the large armchair near the fireplace, where a thick wool blanket sat folded neatly over the armrest. Lily picked up the blanket, unfolded it with quiet care, and walked over to the sofa where Victor lay pretending to sleep. She leaned over him, her movements incredibly gentle as she draped the warm fabric over his shoulders and tucked it around his chest. Victor felt the sudden warmth of the wool, and for a split second, his skin brushed against her fingers, which felt warm and alive compared to his own freezing temperature. He kept his eyes shut, forcing his body to remain completely still. Lily stepped back, looking down at his pale face for a moment, before she spoke in a whisper that was barely louder than the breeze outside. She thanked him for giving her a job at the estate, saying that she would never do anything to let him down or ruin his trust. She picked up her basket of cleaning supplies, turned around, and walked out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door softly behind her. The room became completely silent again, save for the ticking of the clock, leaving Victor alone on the green velvet sofa. He opened his dark eyes, staring at the ceiling as the warmth of the blanket settled over his cold frame. For the first time in over 100 years, Victor felt a strange crack in the defensive walls he had built around his heart. He sat up slowly, throwing the blanket aside, and looking down at the heavy book Lily had placed over his money to protect it. He knew that she had no idea about the hidden camera, meaning her actions were completely honest, driven by nothing but genuine care. He ran a pale hand through his white hair, feeling a deep sense of confusion that he could not easily shake away. He realized that this human woman was far more complicated than any of the people he had met before. The next morning, the sky over Cold Spring was covered in thick gray clouds that brought a cold drizzle down upon the stone walls of the house. Victor stood by the large window in his private study, watching Lily walk across the courtyard with a small basket of fresh lavender she had gathered. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the biting autumn wind, but she smiled as she handed the flowers to Martha, the head housekeeper. Martha took the herbs with a grateful nod, patting Lily on the shoulder before they both disappeared into the warmth of the kitchen wing. Victor let out a slow breath, the glass fogging up slightly before he wiped it clear with his sleeve. He spent the next 3 days watching her through the security monitors, looking for any sign that her kindness was just a temporary performance for the staff. He watched her help Martha carry heavy baskets of wet linens up from the basement, even though laundry was not part of her official duties. He saw her spend an hour cleaning a dusty oil painting of his late mother, using a tiny brush to clear the frame until the silver shone. No one had told her to clean that specific painting, yet she treated the faded face of the woman with immense gentleness and care. On Friday evening, the clock had already passed 9 o'clock, when Victor walked down the back staircase to clear his mind after hours of paperwork. As he passed the glass doors that led to the rear gardens, he spotted the old black car parked beneath the shadow of a large elm tree. Inside the front seat, Thomas was fast asleep, his glasses slipping down his nose and his hands folded loosely over his stomach. Lily appeared from the side entrance of the house, carrying a thick knitted quilt she had retrieved from the hallway storage closet. She opened the car door with incredible care, ensuring the hinges did not make a single sound. She leaned into the vehicle and gently spread the quilt over the old man's shoulders, adjusting the edges so the cold night air would not reach him. Thomas stirred slightly but did not wake, letting out a soft sigh as the warmth of the blanket enveloped him in the dark. Lily smiled, closed the door with a gentle click, and walked back toward the house, her boots splashing softly in the small puddles. Victor stayed hidden in the deep shadows of the stone corridor, watching her pass by without realizing he was standing only a few feet away. His cold heart gave a strange, unfamiliar thud against his ribs. The following morning, Victor arrived in the kitchen before any of the staff had woken up, the room completely dark save for the pale light of dawn. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope containing $300, which he had written out as an advance. He did not sign his name to the paper, simply writing a single line in his sharp, slanted handwriting that told her not to refuse the money. He slipped the envelope beneath Lily's favorite porcelain teacup on the wooden counter, then stepped back into the shadows as he heard footsteps approaching. Lily entered the kitchen a few minutes later, her hair tied in its usual braid and her apron clean, as she began preparing the morning tea. She stopped when she lifted her cup, her eyes widening as she noticed the white envelope sitting on the dark wood of the counter. She picked it up slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the words written across the front in dark ink. She looked around the quiet, empty kitchen, trying to see if anyone was watching her, but the room was completely still and devoid of movement. She pressed the envelope against her chest, her eyes turning soft as a small tear slipped down her cheek. She tucked the money safely into her apron pocket and immediately returned to her work, lighting the stove and chopping fresh wood for the morning fire. Victor watched her from the dark hallway, his arms folded across his chest as he took in the quiet determination in her daily movements. He realized that the money was not a reward for her honesty, but rather a sign that he was beginning to trust her presence. For a man who had lived his entire life in total control, the feeling of trusting a human was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. He turned and walked back to his study, the memory of her soft tears staying with him through the long day. Thursday brought a sudden change to the quiet routine of Stonehaven Hill, as Victor hosted a small luncheon for 4 wealthy historical trustees from the town. The dining room was filled with the clinking of heavy silver forks and the low, serious hum of conversation about local land and old investments. Lily moved around the long table with a silver tray, pouring hot coffee for the guests, with a steady hand and a polite, quiet nod. Everything was going perfectly, until a woman named Mrs. Beatrice Davenport stood up from her seat, her sharp eyes fixed on the floor beneath her chair. She held up a small, folded piece of white cloth for the entire room to see. Mrs. Davenport announced in a loud, dramatic voice that someone had dropped a personal item near her seat, suggesting it was left there on purpose. The room grew completely silent as the other guests turned their heads to look at the small cloth, which had a tiny flower embroidered in the corner. Martha, the housekeeper, quickly stepped forward to take the item, but Mrs. Davenport refused to hand it over, claiming it smelled of cheap lavender. She looked directly at Lily, stating that she knew the old tricks servants used to draw attention to themselves when wealthy men were in the room. The accusation hung heavily in the warm air of the dining room. Victor looked up from the end of the table, his dark eyes narrowing as he recognized the tiny embroidered flower from Lily's note weeks ago. He did not say a word, his face becoming completely unreadable as he dismissed the guests to the library for their remaining afternoon tea. Once the room was empty, Victor called Lily into his private study, where the dim light made the dark wood shelves look even heavier. Lily stood near the desk, her hands folded tightly over her white apron, and her face pale, though her posture remained entirely straight. Martha stood beside her, her eyes filled with worry for the young woman. Victor leaned against the edge of his desk, his white hair catching the shadows as he held up the small white cloth between 2 fingers. He asked Lily if the item belonged to her, his voice low and calm, showing none of the anger that Mrs. Davenport had displayed. Lily looked down at the cloth, nodded her head slowly, and explained that it must have fallen from her pocket while she was dusting. Victor asked her why she had not defended herself against the harsh words in the dining room, preferring to stay completely silent instead. Lily hesitated, her fingers clenching the fabric of her apron before she took a slow breath. She whispered that defending herself never mattered, because people always chose to believe whatever story made them feel superior or safe from the truth. She explained that at her previous job, in a small care home, an elderly patient named Mr. Davis had suddenly collapsed from severe blood loss. The ambulance was delayed by a massive snowstorm, so she had allowed the facility doctor to use her own blood to keep the man alive. Victor's breath caught in his throat as she spoke, his sharp mind processing the fact that this human had given her blood willingly. It was the ultimate act of life, something his own kind took by force. Lily continued her story, her voice cracking slightly as she explained that a few days later, a gold ring was reported missing from the old man's drawer. The supervisor found the ring tucked inside the bottom of Lily's laundry cart, and no one bothered to ask her if she had actually taken it. They simply fired her on the spot, telling her to leave the town immediately, without giving her a single chance to explain her innocence. She learned that day that when people want to see you as a thief, no amount of words will ever change their minds. She looked up at Victor, her brown eyes clear and completely free of any guilt. She told him that she would pack her small suitcase and leave Stonehaven Hill before the evening sun went down, thanking him again for the weeks of employment. She turned toward the door, but Victor stepped forward, his long, dark coat moving behind him as his voice rang out clearly through the quiet room. He told her that she was not going anywhere, his hand reaching out to gently press the embroidered cloth back into her rough palm. He looked down into her eyes, his expression softer than Martha had ever seen it during her 40 years of service at the grand estate. He told her that he had been entirely wrong about her motives, and he apologized for allowing his own past doubts to cloud his judgment of her character. He told her that she never had to explain herself to anyone in this house again, because her actions had already proven exactly who she was. Lily stood frozen for a second, her shoulders dropping as the heavy weight of the old accusation finally lifted from her mind. A single tear ran down her cheek, followed by another, but she did not look away from the white-haired master who stood before her. For the first time in years, she felt completely safe. The morning after the dinner incident, the cold rain stopped, leaving the grounds of the estate covered in a thick, mysterious fog that clung to the trees. Lily was in the back hallway organizing the clean linens when Victor approached her, his steps completely silent against the stone floor until he spoke her name. She turned around, a bit startled, but relaxed when she saw the calm expression on his pale marble face as he looked down at her. He asked her to walk with him for a few minutes, turning around to lead the way toward the heavy glass doors at the rear of the house. He led her past the old stone greenhouse and down a narrow path lined with wild bushes until they reached a high wooden gate covered in dead ivy. Victor pushed the gate open, the old iron hinges groaning loudly in the quiet morning air as they stepped into a hidden, circular garden. The space was completely overgrown with wild white roses that curled around old stone benches, the air smelling faintly of dry earth and sweet jasmine. Victor kept his hands behind his back, his white hair standing out brightly against the dark green leaves that covered the surrounding stone walls. He told her that this specific garden had belonged to his mother, a woman who had passed away more than 100 years ago during a long winter. He confessed that he had not allowed a single person to step through the gate since her departure, because the memories inside were too precious to risk. He turned to face Lily, his dark eyes holding hers with a level of honesty that made her heart beat a little faster in her chest. He told her that he owed her a real apology for doubting her honesty when she first arrived at his home. He explained that he had spent his entire existence believing that good people always fought loudly to prove their worth and defend their names against lies. But she had taught him that the strongest people often say the least, choosing silence not out of fear, but because they know their value. He stepped a bit closer, his freezing hand resting against the rough wood of the old gate as he looked around the peaceful, hidden space. He told her that for a long time, this garden had felt like a tomb for the past, but today it felt alive again. From that day forward, small changes began to alter the cold atmosphere of Stonehaven Hill, softening the sharp lines between the master and the staff. Every morning at 7 o'clock, Victor would walk down to the small side kitchen to pour himself a cup of black tea before the day began. He began pouring a second cup for Lily, setting it quietly onto the wooden table beside her basket of clean cloths before he sat down. At first, she had tried to refuse the gesture, but his quiet persistence eventually won her over, and they spent 20 minutes sitting together in silence. They did not speak about his secrets or her past during those early hours, but the shared quiet created a deep bond that neither of them could deny. One afternoon, he called her into the massive library, where thousands of leather books sat on towering shelves that reached the high plaster ceiling. He told her that he wanted to donate half of the collection to the town library and asked her to choose which books should stay. Lily blinked in surprise, asking him why he would trust her judgment with such old and valuable pieces of history. Victor simply smiled, his pale face lighting up in a way that made him look completely human for a brief moment in the dim light. He told her that he trusted her heart more than he trusted any map or blueprint he had ever bought with his endless wealth. Lily spent the next 4 days organizing the volumes, her fingers tracing the old pages as Victor watched her from his desk across the room. He realized that the cold walls of his estate were no longer keeping the world out, but rather holding something beautiful inside. A massive thunderstorm hit the valley on Tuesday night, sending fierce winds howling through the dark pine trees and shaking the heavy windows of the house. Inside the grand halls, the lights flickered 3 times before going out completely, leaving the entire estate in total darkness save for the lightning outside. The backup generator kicked on a few seconds later, lighting the main corridors but leaving the old kitchen wing completely dark and cold. Victor grabbed a heavy silver flashlight from the front desk and began walking down the stone steps to check on the lower rooms. As he turned the corner near the scullery, he spotted a flash of white movement near the large glass windows that looked out toward the western hills. He found Lily pressing a thick bundle of towels against the corner of a large window pane that had cracked under the wind. Cold rainwater was pouring through the gap, soaking the front of her gray dress and causing her entire body to shiver violently in the dark. Her brown braid had come loose, her long hair clinging to her damp neck as she struggled to hold the glass against the storm. Victor did not say a word as he dropped his flashlight onto the counter and walked directly into the freezing water that flooded the stone floor. He took off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders, his hands instantly taking her place against the cracked glass pane. He told her to step back, his immense strength allowing him to hold the heavy window steady with a single hand while the wind slammed against it. He picked up a wooden wedge from the counter and jammed it into the frame, sealing the gap until the water stopped. He then took her hand, his pale fingers wrapping around her warm wrist as he guided her out of the dark scullery and into the small pantry nearby. The pantry was narrow and dry, lit by a single amber emergency light that cast long, warm shadows across the shelves of food. Lily stood near the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she wore his massive coat, which reached down past her knees. Victor poured fresh water from a copper pitcher into a small metal pot, setting it over a small propane burner to heat. They stayed silent for 10 minutes, while the storm rumbled outside, the sound of the rain against the stone walls filling the small space between them. Victor looked at her from the corner of his eye, noticing how small she looked wrapped inside the heavy black fabric of his winter coat. He asked her in a quiet voice why she had stayed at the estate after everything that had happened during her first month. Lily looked up, her brown eyes catching the amber glow of the lamp as she looked at his pale marble face. She whispered that she had stayed because she realized that no one had ever truly needed her quiet care the way this lonely house did. She added that she could not bring herself to leave a man who was still carrying a massive amount of pain while pretending to be entirely fine. Victor's breath caught in his throat, her simple words cutting straight through the heavy armor he had worn for more than 2 centuries. He turned his face away, staring at the small bubbles forming at the bottom of the heating water as his throat tightened. He confessed that he did not know how to be soft or open with people, because his long life had taught him only how to survive. Lily stepped closer to him, her bare feet making no sound on the dry floor, as she reached out a hand toward his arm. She told him that he did not need to know how to do it, because he only needed to allow himself to feel it. Victor turned back to look at her, his dark eyes dropping to her face, which was still damp from the cold rain outside. He reached out his right hand, his movements incredibly slow as his pale fingers hovered near her cheek before gently brushing a stray lock of hair away. His cold skin rested against her warm cheek for 3 seconds, a gentle touch that held no force, no control, and no hidden motives. Lily did not pull away from his touch, her eyes staying fixed on his as she let out a soft, warm breath into the dark. In that tiny room, surrounded by the roaring storm, 2 entirely different worlds finally found a way to meet. The night of the annual Spring Charity Gala arrived with a clear sky that allowed the full moon to light up the stone towers of Stonehaven Hill. The long driveway was lined with strings of small amber lights, their glow reflecting off the polished black cars that arrived one after another from the town. Wealthy guests stepped out in long silk gowns and expensive black suits, their laughter mixing with the music of a string quartet near the fountain. Lily stood near the grand entrance doors, a small wooden clipboard in her hands as she greeted each person with a polite bow. Victor had asked her to oversee the entire guest list and the seating arrangements for the evening, trusting her completely with the important task. Lily had been incredibly nervous when he first brought it up, pointing out that she was just a simple maid who knew nothing of high society. But Victor had looked into her eyes and told her that there was no one else in the world he would rather trust with his home. Now she moved through the crowded ballroom with a calm confidence, her simple blue cotton dress looking elegant amid the flash of cameras. From the far corner of the grand room, Victor watched her every move while he stood with 3 local politicians who were talking about tax rates. His white hair was combed back perfectly, and his black suit fit him beautifully, but his eyes never stayed on the men for more than a second. He watched Lily hand a glass of water to an elderly woman, who looked tired, smiling warmly as she helped her find a seat. He realized that she had not changed her simple nature at all, but her inner light was finally being allowed to shine. At 9 o'clock, the music stopped as the head trustee tapped a silver spoon against his glass, calling for the master of the house to speak. Victor stepped onto the low wooden stage in the center of the ballroom, adjusting the microphone with a calm, practiced movement of his long fingers. He looked out at the crowd of wealthy faces before his gaze drifted to the back of the room, where Lily stood near the door. He began by saying that he had given many speeches about land, buildings, and financial investments over the last few decades of his life. But tonight, he wanted to tell them a story about a person who had arrived at his estate with absolutely nothing but 2 willing hands. He explained that this person had reminded him through her daily actions that true goodness never shouts or looks for praise from the world. He stated that the greatest strength was often found in those who choose to serve others without ever asking for a single word of recognition in return. He looked directly at Lily, whose eyes had grown wide with surprise as she pressed the wooden clipboard against her apron. He did not mention her name to the crowd, stating that her actions were far too valuable to be thrown around a room full of strangers. The ballroom remained completely silent for 2 seconds before a wave of polite applause broke out among the guests, regular people nodding their heads in agreement. Victor stepped down from the stage and walked straight through the crowd toward the back doorway, ignoring the hands that reached out to shake his. He stopped in front of Lily, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, square box made of dark blue velvet. He placed the box into her hands, telling her to open it, while the music began to play softly again in the main room. Lily lifted the lid with trembling fingers, her breath catching as she saw a delicate silver necklace shaped like a tiny night-blooming rose. She recognized the design instantly from the old oil painting in the hallway, knowing it had belonged to the mother he missed so dearly. Victor whispered that his mother always believed that those who kept light in their hearts would never lose their way in the dark. He told her that she had brought that light back into his cold house, and he wanted her to keep the silver as a permanent reminder of his gratitude. Lily looked up from the shining metal, her brown eyes filled with tears that she did not try to hide from him this time. She could not find the words to speak, but the soft look in her eyes told Victor everything he had waited over a century to hear. He knew that he no longer saw her as a servant, but as the most important part of his existence. The white envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked neatly beneath the small porcelain teapot that sat on the long wooden counter of the kitchen. Lily opened the paper with careful movements, her eyes scanning the dark ink lines that lay out the official details of a full university scholarship. The Hawthorne Educational Foundation had awarded her a complete 4-year degree in botanical medicine at a prestigious college in the neighboring city. The paper stated that all her tuition, books, and living expenses had already been paid in full by an anonymous donor who wished her well. At the very bottom of the white sheet, a single sentence was written in the familiar, sharp handwriting she had come to recognize over the weeks. The note told her that someone believed in her talent, and it was time for her to go become the person she was meant to be. Lily knew instantly that Victor had arranged the gift, using his vast wealth to give her back the future that had been stolen years ago. She found him sitting in the sunroom later that afternoon, his white hair bright against the glass windows. She walked over to his chair and told him quietly that she would be leaving the estate in 2 weeks to begin her first semester of study. Victor did not look upset by the news, a gentle smile appearing on his pale face as he stood up to face her near the glass. He told her that he was incredibly happy for her, adding that the heavy doors of Stonehaven Hill would always remain open for her return. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low, as he told her that he would be waiting right here on the hill, no matter how many years passed. Lily left the grand estate on a bright Sunday morning, carrying the same small brown suitcase she had brought with her 4 weeks prior to this day. She stood at the large iron gates for 3 minutes, looking back at the high stone towers of the house where her life had changed. She could see Victor standing at the high balcony window, his white hair catching the morning light as he watched her car pull away down the road. She did not allow herself to cry until the house had completely disappeared behind the dark pine trees of the mountain. 6 months passed quickly, bringing a cold autumn back to the small town of Cold Spring, covering the garden paths with a thick carpet of orange leaves. In the hidden garden at the rear of the estate, Victor was kneeling on the damp soil, his heavy black coat tossed onto a nearby bench. His white sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and his pale hands were covered in dark dirt as he carefully trimmed the wild rose bushes. He had spent the last 2 months working in the soil himself, refusing to let the regular gardeners touch his mother's favorite white flowers. He did not hear the old wooden gate creak open behind him, his mind focused entirely on the small green stem he was trying to save from the frost. He stopped when he heard a soft, familiar voice ask him if he was still struggling to keep the rose lines straight after all this time. Victor turned around slowly, his dark eyes widening as he stood up from the dark earth to face the path behind him. Lily stood there, her hair a bit longer and her face bright with a warm smile that made his cold heart skip a beat. She carried a small canvas bag over her shoulder and held a tiny wrapped parcel in her hands, her boots covered in dust from the long walk. Victor stood frozen for 3 seconds, his pale hands dropping to his sides as he stared at the woman he had missed every single night. Lily walked down the path toward him, handing him the small parcel before she looked around at the clean, beautiful garden he had worked to maintain. He opened the paper with shaking fingers, lifting out a beautiful white cloth that had been handmade with care. In the corner of the linen, 2 names were embroidered together in beautiful silver thread, surrounded by a small pattern of night-blooming roses. Victor looked down at the silver stitches, a soft laugh escaping his lips as he looked back up into her clear brown eyes. He asked her if she had left this piece of cloth on purpose this time, his hand reaching out to catch hers in the cold air. Lily stepped into his arms, her head resting against his chest, as she whispered that she had brought it because she was never leaving again. The future no longer looked like a long gray corridor of endless years spent hiding in the dark corners of an old stone estate. As I stand by the high glass windows of the sunroom, watching the golden light of late afternoon settle over the valley, I can feel a deep sense of peace. The silver necklace rests warm against my skin, a constant reminder that the walls we build to protect ourselves can always be broken by a gentle hand. Victor is walking down the garden path below, his white hair catching the last rays of the sun as he stops to check on the new green shoots. He moves with a lightness that he did not possess when I first walked through the heavy front doors of his home. We have learned that time does not need to be a burden, whether you have 80 years or 800 years left to live in this world. The small town of Cold Spring is still quiet, but the house on the hill is no longer a place of fear or cold secrets for the people below. We spend our evenings sitting in the small kitchen, sharing tea, and talking about the books we have read, or the plants we want to grow in the coming spring. There are no grand promises or loud declarations between us, because we have found that the truest love is lived in the small, quiet actions of each passing day. I know that tomorrow will bring more chores, more lessons, and more variations of the changing seasons, but I am no longer afraid of what lies ahead in the dark. We have found a way to bridge the distance between the mortal world and the endless night, building a life out of nothing but honesty and simple care. As the sun dips below the mountains, leaving the sky filled with a soft violet light, I turn away from the window to prepare the evening tea for the man who saved my heart.